At 03:47 hours on May 5, 1945, Private First Class Desmond Thomas Doss crouched at the lip of a 400-foot limestone cliff on the island of Okinawa and listened to men dying below him. He was 26 years old, 5 feet 9 inches tall, 150 pounds, soaking wet. He carried no rifle, no pistol, no grenade. In the entire American invasion force that had landed on Okinawa 34 days earlier, Desmond Doss was the only man who had gone ashore completely unarmed. By choice, by conviction, by the same unshakable faith that had made him a target of ridicule since the first morning he reported for basic training at Fort Jackson, South Carolina. The escarpment behind him was called Maeda by the Japanese. The Americans called it Hacksaw Ridge. It stretched roughly 300 yards across and rose nearly vertical from the plain below, its surface carved by rain and shellfire into a jagged moonscape of shell craters, collapsed bunkers, and shattered coral. And somewhere in that darkness ahead of him, between 100 and 150 American soldiers, lay wounded, abandoned, still breathing. Men of the 307th Infantry Regiment, 77th Infantry Division, men who had gone up the ridge on May 3rd with hope and come back down on May 4th in pieces, men who had gone up again and not come back at all. The Japanese counterattack that swept Hacksaw Ridge in the early hours of May 5th had been coordinated, ferocious, and designed with one purpose: take back every yard of ground the Americans had clawed from them since April 29th. It largely succeeded. By 0200 hours, the 1st Battalion of the 307th Infantry had been pushed off the escarpment's crest and was reforming in the darkness below, counting its dead and trying to account for the wounded who hadn't made it to the ropes. The ropes were how you got off Hacksaw Ridge. Had cargo nets and knotted lines that the engineers had strung over the cliff face to allow men to descend under fire. When the Japanese counterattack hit, the scramble for those ropes had been desperate and disorganized. Some men made it. Some didn't reach the ropes at all. Some reached them and were shot climbing down. The ones still up on the escarpment, unable to move, lay in shell craters and swales in the rock, listening to Japanese soldiers move past them in the dark. Desmond Doss was preparing to go back up. He was a medic, a combat medic, 1st Platoon, Company B, 307th Infantry, and by every regulation, by every precedent, by every instinct of self-preservation that evolution had spent 400 million years refining, there was no requirement for him to climb back up that cliff. The Army had told him repeatedly, in basic training and in the weeks before the Okinawa landings, that a medic's job was to treat the wounded, not to retrieve them from behind enemy lines. The Army had also told him, repeatedly, and with increasing hostility, that his refusal to carry a weapon made him a liability and possibly a coward. Desmond Doss had a different opinion on both counts. He tied off his rope to a tree stump at the cliff's edge, tested the knot 3 times, he said a prayer that took 11 seconds. He'd been saying variations of the same prayer since he was 8 years old, and it had become as automatic as breathing, and went over the edge. What happened in the next 12 hours on Hacksaw Ridge would eventually produce a Medal of Honor citation, a biographical film that grossed $180 million at the global box office, and a permanent place in the military's understanding of what courage actually looks like. But on the night of May 5, 1945, and as Desmond Doss hauled himself back up the cliff face, one handhold at a time, none of that existed. There was only the rock, the darkness, and somewhere ahead of him the sound of men who needed help. This is the story of how one unarmed soldier rescued 20 of his brothers from Hacksaw Ridge, and then turned around and did it again, and again, and again. To understand what Desmond Doss was doing on that cliff, you have to go back to Lynchburg, Virginia, 1924. Lynchburg sits in the Piedmont region of central Virginia, wedged between the Blue Ridge Mountains to the west and the rolling tobacco and grain country to the east. In 1924, it was a city of approximately 30,000 people, heavily churched, economically stratified, and deeply shaped by the memory of the Civil War, which in Lynchburg's case was not an abstract historical event, but a living inheritance. visible in the veterans' memorials, in the family stories passed around supper tables, yet in the Confederate flags that still flew over certain businesses on Main Street. William Thomas Doss, Desmond's father, was a World War I veteran who had come home from France with damaged lungs, a taste for alcohol that would grow steadily worse through the Depression years, and a faith in God that had not survived the trenches intact. Bertha Oliver Doss, Desmond's mother, had faith enough for both of them and then some. She was a Seventh-day Adventist, and she raised her 3 children, Harold, Desmond, and Audrey, in that tradition with a thoroughness that left little room for compromise. The Seventh-day Adventist Church in the 1920s and 1930s was not a mainstream denomination. It kept the Sabbath from sundown Friday to sundown Saturday, which meant no work, no play, no cooking, and no secular activity of any kind for 24 hours each week. It was strict on diet, no pork, limited meat, no alcohol or tobacco, and it interpreted the 6th commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," with what most Americans would consider an unusual literalness. To a committed Seventh-day Adventist in Bertha Doss's tradition, that commandment meant exactly what it said. Not, "Thou shalt not commit murder," "Thou shalt not kill." Full stop. Desmond grew up with a religious picture on the wall of the family home on Easley Avenue. It depicted the story of Cain and Abel, Cain standing over his fallen brother, had the first murder in the biblical account, and beneath it a simple legend, "Thou shalt do no murder." He stared at that picture for years. It shaped something fundamental in how he understood the world. He also grew up watching his father's alcoholism take the family apart and put it back together in a different shape, watching his parents fight, then watching his father pull a pistol during one terrible argument, and his mother snatch it away and hand it to Desmond and tell him to get it out of the house. He walked to a neighbor's and left the gun there. He was probably 11 or 12. The feeling of that pistol in his hands, its weight, its purpose, its potential, stayed with him. He was not a soft boy. He was not timid or passive. He worked from the age of 12, doing odd jobs, eventually finding steady work at the Lynchburg Lumber Company, where he learned carpentry and developed the kind of physical endurance that comes from a decade of lifting, hauling, and shaping heavy timber. He was quiet, but not shy. He had a girlfriend, Dorothy Schutte, a young woman he'd met through church, whom he would eventually marry 11 days before he shipped out to the Pacific. On December 7th, 1941, Desmond Doss was 23 years old and working in a defense industry job at the Newport News shipyard that would have qualified him for an occupational deferment. He didn't apply for it. He registered for the draft in February 1942 and was inducted into the Army in April of that year. When the induction officer asked him to state his classification, Desmond Doss said he was a conscientious objector, not, he was careful to explain, a pacifist. He was not opposed to the war. Yet he was not sympathetic to the enemy. He believed the United States was right to fight. He simply could not, in good conscience, take a human life under any circumstances, and he could not handle a firearm on Saturday, the Sabbath, without violating his religious commitments. The Army did not have a clean category for this. The official Conscientious Objector classification in 1942 carried the designation 1AO, which meant a man was willing to serve in a non-combat role. Desmond Doss was more than willing. He wanted to serve as a medic. He wanted to be in the front lines. He just wouldn't carry a gun. The Army's response was, predictably, something between confusion and contempt. Fort Jackson, South Carolina, in the summer of 1942, was a furnace wearing a uniform. The installation sprawled across 52,000 acres of South Carolina sandhills terrain, pine trees, sand, red clay, and in heat that hit like a physical object every morning when you stepped outside the barracks. Desmond Doss arrived at Fort Jackson as a member of the 77th Infantry Division. He was assigned to a training company and immediately became a problem. Not because he was difficult, not because he was uncooperative, not because he couldn't do the physical work. He could, and he did, matching his fellow trainees on every run, every crawl, every exercise. The problem was the rifle. And every Saturday morning, the company fell out for rifle training. Every Saturday morning, Desmond Doss remained in the barracks, not hiding, not pretending to be sick. He was reading the Bible, which is what a Seventh-day Adventist does on the Sabbath. His sergeant would come in, find him sitting on his bunk, and the exchange would go something like this. Sergeant: Doss, formations outside. Doss: Yes, Sergeant, I can't participate today. Out, it's the Sabbath. Sergeant: I don't care what day it is. Get your rifle. Doss: I'll be happy to come out and help with anything that doesn't involve weapons, Sergeant. This happened every week for months. The sergeants tried everything: extra duty, threats of court-martial, assignments to the worst details, latrine cleaning, kitchen work, all-night guard rotations. Desmond Doss did every piece of extra duty without complaint and returned to his Bible on Saturday morning. His fellow trainees were less formal in their approach. They threw boots at him while he slept. They called him a coward, a draft dodger, a religious nut. They made his life uncomfortable in the 100 small ways that a barracks full of young men can make one man's life uncomfortable. Some of them came to believe, sincerely, that Desmond Doss was going to get them killed in combat by refusing to shoot at the enemy. What they didn't fully grasp yet was that Desmond Doss had never claimed he wouldn't put himself between the enemy and his fellow soldiers. He'd claimed he wouldn't shoot anybody. That's a distinction that would eventually become very important on Hacksaw Ridge. There were attempts to discharge him. His commanding officers wrote recommendations that he be removed from the Army as unsuitable. The paperwork went up the chain and came back down without resolution. So the Army's legal framework for dealing with conscientious objectors who wanted to serve in combat roles was, in 1942, still being worked out. Doss fell into the gap. He went through training. He was assigned to a medical detachment. He learned battlefield first aid, triage procedures, and how to apply a tourniquet under pressure. He got good at it, very good actually. He had steady hands, a calm manner, and a pain tolerance that his instructors noticed. Yet he'd treat his own small injuries with the same methodical attention he gave to training dummies. He did not flinch. In 1944, the 77th Infantry Division shipped out for the Pacific. They landed first on Guam, where they fought through 6 weeks of brutal jungle combat, then on Leyte in the Philippines. By the time they waded ashore on Okinawa on April 1st, 1945, they were experienced soldiers. They had seen what artillery does to a man, what a .25 caliber rifle round does at close range, what a bonsai charge sounds like in the dark. Desmond Doss had been in the middle of all of it, without a weapon. His company commander on Guam, Captain Jack Glover, had initially been hostile to the idea of an unarmed medic. After Guam, Glover wrote in his after-action notes that Doss had treated the wounded under fire, on multiple occasions, with a steadiness that he had not seen in trained combat veterans. He stopped trying to have him transferred. The men of 1st Platoon, Company B, had also changed their assessment. Not all of them. Some maintained their skepticism until the end. But enough of them had watched Doss crawl into fire to pull out a wounded man. Enough of them had been treated by him under mortar fire that the boots at night routine had largely stopped. They called him Doss now, not the coward or the nut. Some of them called him Doc, which is what combat soldiers call a medic they trust. He carried a canvas medical bag and an aid pouch on each hip and a New Testament in his breast pocket. That was it. The rifle squads around him carried M1 Garand semi-automatic rifles, 8-round en-bloc clips, 9.5 pounds each. The bar gunners carried Browning automatic rifles, 19 pounds loaded, capable of 600 rounds per minute. The machine gun teams carried M1919, A4 Brownings, and several thousand rounds of linked ammunition. The company as a whole carried grenades, bayonets, trench knives, carbines, smoke canisters, and bazookas. Desmond Doss carried morphine syrettes, plasma, sulfa powder, bandages, and his Bible. It was, in one particular way, the most dangerous configuration possible. A medic without a weapon on a 20th century battlefield is not protected by the Geneva Conventions in the way textbooks suggest. Japanese military doctrine in 1945 did not consistently distinguish between armed and unarmed combatants. Yet the Red Cross markings on his helmet and armband made him a target as often as they made him a non-target. He knew this. He had known it since Guam. He went anyway, every time. Okinawa, April 1945. Operation Iceberg. The island was 60 miles long and 2 to 18 miles wide. It held roughly 120,000 Japanese defenders under Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, who had spent 2 years preparing for exactly this invasion. Yet his strategy was not to stop the Americans at the beach. He'd watched that fail on Tarawa, on Peleliu, on Iwo Jima. His strategy was to let them come ashore and then bleed them slowly from fortified positions in the island's mountainous interior. The Americans came ashore on April 1st, 1945. Roughly 183,000 troops. The largest amphibious operation in the Pacific War, larger even than D-Day in terms of total forces engaged. They expected fierce resistance at the beach and found almost none. For the first few days they advanced rapidly, taking the Yontan and Kadena airfields, securing the center of the island. Then they hit the Shuri Line. The Shuri Line was a network of interlocking defensive positions anchored on Shuri Castle in the center of the island and extending to both coasts. It incorporated natural terrain features, ridges, escarpments, cave systems, and artificial ones, concrete bunkers, spider holes, tunnel complexes that connected positions miles apart, and every American attack would be observed from multiple angles. Every American casualty would be covered by fire from 3 directions. The Maeda Escarpment, Hacksaw Ridge, was the right center anchor of the Shuri Line's northern face. The 77th Infantry Division was assigned to crack it. They tried on April 29th. They got up the cliff face using cargo nets and captured about 100 yards of the escarpment's crest before Japanese counterfire drove them back. They tried again on April 30th, and then May 1st, then May 2nd. Each time they made it to the top, each time the Japanese defensive fire, mortars, machine guns, knee mortars, grenades rolled along the cliff face made holding the position untenable. Casualties mounted. By May 2nd, Company B alone had lost more than 30 men killed or wounded. Desmond Doss treated all of them. He worked the aid station at the base of the cliff. He worked the litter teams on the approaches. And then he went up the cliff himself when wounded men were trapped on the escarpment's surface. The Japanese had a particularly effective tactic that the Americans called playing dead. Wounded or apparently dead, Japanese soldiers would lie still until an American medic moved to treat them, then detonate a grenade. It happened to American medics on Okinawa multiple times, in multiple locations. Doss knew about it. He treated Japanese wounded anyway, with the same care and morphine he gave to Americans. This was not naivety. This was a considered moral position. The man bleeding in front of him was a human being, and his training said, treat the man bleeding in front of you. On May 3rd, the 307th Infantry was ordered up Hacksaw Ridge again. This time they made it. They secured roughly 200 yards of the escarpment's crest, set up a perimeter, and dug in. The Japanese let them dig for 12 hours. Then came May 4th. Yet the Japanese counterattack began at 1:30 hours on May 4th. It was not a frontal assault. It came from multiple directions simultaneously, coordinated by an elaborate signaling system, artillery, mortars, infantry, and waves. The Japanese had tunnels under the escarpment that allowed them to emerge from positions the Americans thought they'd secured. In the darkness, unit cohesion collapsed. Squads became separated. Officers lost contact with platoons. But the 307th Infantry fell back off the escarpment. Most of them. Some didn't make it. When the sun came up on May 4th, it was possible to see, from the base of the cliff, figures moving on the escarpment's surface. Some of them were Japanese. Some of them were Americans who hadn't gotten off. Desmond Doss could see the ones who were still alive. They weren't visible for long. The Japanese would shoot anyone who showed themselves. But in the early morning light, before full daylight made movement suicidal, you could see shapes in the shell craters. He counted. At least 20 Americans still alive on the escarpment. Probably more. The 307th was regrouping. There was no immediate plan to go back up. The escarpment's crest was fully back in Japanese hands, and mounting another assault in daylight, with depleted companies and inadequate artillery preparation, was not an option the regimental commander was ready to order yet. Desmond Doss requested permission to go back up. His company commander, Captain Frank Vernon, heard the request and was quiet for a long moment. Then he said that no one was ordering anybody up that cliff right now, but he wasn't ordering anybody to stay down either. That was the answer Doss needed. He went up the cargo net at 0730 hours on May 4th, 1945. The net was a standard military cargo net, manila rope, 6-inch squares, stiff with salt and wear, and it hung down the limestone face of the escarpment, occasionally swinging in the wind that came off the East China Sea. Climbing it while wearing a full medical kit, in daylight, with Japanese soldiers 200 yards away, was the kind of action that an infantry tactician would classify as suicidal, and a medic would classify as necessary. He climbed fast. The training at Fort Jackson, which he'd done in full every day except Saturday, had made him strong in the shoulders and forearms. But he reached the top in under 4 minutes, rolled over the lip, and immediately flattened himself against the coral. The escarpment surface was roughly 300 yards of broken terrain. Shell craters 3 and 4 feet deep, pockmarking the ground at irregular intervals. The remains of American fighting positions, sandbags, wire, broken weapons, bodies, Japanese and American intermingled, some in positions that showed they'd died fighting hand to hand. So Japanese soldiers occupied the far end of the escarpment and the reverse slopes. They were not, in the early morning of May 4th, actively patrolling the center of the ridge. They were consolidating their recaptured positions and dealing with their own casualties from the night's fighting. This gave Desmond Doss a window of time, narrow and unpredictable. That was the only reason what he was about to do was possible at all. He moved on his stomach, pushing with his elbows and toes, and the way he'd been trained. The first wounded man he found was Private Harold Lauer, 2nd Platoon, his right arm gone below the elbow and a tourniquet that someone had applied during the night's retreat. The tourniquet had held. Lauer was conscious, barely. His face was gray. Doss checked the tourniquet, still tight, and administered a morphine syringe. He spoke quietly. You're okay, Harold. I'm going to get you out." He didn't know if that was true. He needed to believe it was. Getting a 160-pound man with one functional arm back to the cliff's edge, across 100 yards of open ground and shell craters, without attracting Japanese fire, was a problem that had no elegant solution. The litter carries, taught in basic training, assumed 2 bearers, a prepared route, and no active enemy. None of those conditions applied. What Doss had was a rope, specifically a length of 3/8-inch hemp rope, 60 feet long, that he carried coiled over one shoulder. Said he'd started carrying rope on Guam after watching 2 men take fire trying to drag a 3rd man across open ground. The rope let him low crawl while keeping his load moving behind him. He rigged a simple harness under Lauer's armpits, took the rope's other end, and began pulling. The distance to the cliff's edge was approximately 90 yards. In good conditions, on flat ground, with a cooperative patient, that's a 5-minute carry. On Hacksaw Ridge's surface, yet with Lauer semi-conscious and the rope catching on every piece of shattered coral, it took 40 minutes. 3 times they passed within 40 yards of Japanese soldiers, and each time Doss froze and waited, watching the soldiers move, calculating angles and blind spots the way a hunter calculates wind and cover. The Japanese didn't see them. Or they did and chose not to investigate. In the chaos of the morning after a night counterattack, with their own wounded to deal with and positions to reestablish, a single moving shape in a shell crater may have been below their threshold of attention. Doss got Lauer to the cliff's edge. He rigged a second harness for the descent, a proper bowline loop around the torso, snugged under the armpits, and lowered him over the edge. The men at the bottom had been watching through binoculars and were ready to receive him. Then Doss turned around and went back. And this is the part that requires a specific kind of understanding to grasp. He had just spent 40 minutes pulling one man across 90 yards of contested ground. He had used most of his morphine. He had expended significant physical energy. He was now, by any military measure, a single man on an enemy-held position, with no weapon, no support, and no route of reinforcement. He went back. The second man he found was Corporal James Dorris, partially buried by a collapsed shell crater's wall, conscious enough to ask for water. Doss gave him water from his own canteen, then started digging with his hands. The first 4 hours on Hacksaw Ridge on May 4th followed a rhythm that Doss would later describe as just moving from man to man. That understates it considerably. What he was doing was conducting a one-man search and rescue operation across 200 yards of actively contested terrain, carrying no offensive weapons, treating wounds with a finite medical supply, and making continuous decisions about which injured men were retrievable and which were beyond help. That last calculation, triage, is one of the hardest things a medic can do, and it never gets easier. In a mass casualty situation, you do not treat men in the order you find them. You treat them in the order they're likely to survive. A man with a sucking chest wound and no pulse takes your time away from 3 men with controllable bleeding who can survive. You make that calculation in seconds, but with incomplete information, and you live with it. Doss made it 14 times on May 4th, finding men who were beyond saving, acknowledging it, moving on. The ones he reached in time: Corporal Dorris, retrieved from the collapsed crater, right leg shattered below the knee. Private Eddie Lawson, who'd taken a round through the shoulder and another through his pack, both wounds ugly but neither immediately fatal. Sergeant Roy Grimes, who'd been playing dead for 7 hours beside the body of his squad leader, the one thing that had saved his life when Japanese soldiers swept through the position at 0300. Private First Class Daniel Mayberry, unconscious from blood loss. A field dressing applied by someone during the retreat that had slowed but not stopped the bleeding. Each man was a different problem. Dorris needed his leg immobilized before any movement. Doss splinted it with a broken rifle stock he found nearby. And Lawson needed his shoulder wound irrigated and repacked. The sulfa powder in Doss's kit took care of the infection risk. Grimes needed water and time. He was dehydrated and in shock more than physically wounded. Mayberry needed a new pressure dressing immediately, or he wouldn't survive the trip to the cliff's edge. Each man, once treated and stable enough to move, was loaded into Doss's rope harness and pulled to the edge. Each man was lowered down the cliff face to the waiting hands below. Doss developed a method. He would fix a wounded man's immediate medical needs, administer morphine if indicated, rig the harness, and get the man to within 10 yards of the cliff's edge. Then he'd call down, quietly, not loudly, and the men below would call back when they were ready. He'd lower the casualty. Then, while they were unrigging the harness and getting the man to an aid station, Doss would go back across the escarpment for another. The cycle took between 35 and 90 minutes per man, depending on the severity of his wounds and his distance from the cliff. By 1400 hours, Desmond Doss had been on Hacksaw Ridge's surface for 6.5 hours. He had retrieved 11 men. He was nearly out of morphine. His medical bag had been replenished twice, with supplies hauled up the cliff by volunteers who came up during brief lulls in Japanese fire, men who were armed and scared, and who came up anyway because Doss was up there alone, and they were not going to leave him up there alone. At approximately 14-15 hours, a Japanese grenade landed in the shell crater where Doss had taken cover and was treating Private Wesley Byrd. The grenade was the stick type, a Model 97, 530 grams, 5-second fuse. Doss saw it, grabbed it with both hands, and then threw it back toward the Japanese position. It detonated in the air, perhaps 20 feet away. The concussion knocked him backward. Shrapnel cut the back of his right hand. He wrapped his hand with a bandage from his own kit, working with his left hand, which was awkward, and continued treating Bird. At 1500 hours, Corporal Clarence Glenn came up the cargo net with a fresh medical kit, 2 canteens, and the news that Captain Vernon was requesting Doss come down for the day. The regiment was planning another assault for the following morning, May 5th, and they'd need him rested. Doss told Glenn to tell the captain he'd be down when he'd gotten everybody. Glenn looked at him for a moment, then he went back down the rope. The afternoon of May 4th was quieter than the morning. The Japanese were consolidating their positions, moving through underground tunnel networks, bringing up ammunition and supplies. They were not, in the early afternoon, and actively patrolling the open ground of the escarpment center. This gave Doss a longer window of relative safety, if relative safety has any meaning on a ridge where a mortar could land anywhere at any moment. He found 5 more men in the afternoon. A bar gunner named Randall Pottinger, who'd been lying in a hollow in the rock since 0200 hours, conscious the whole time, listening to Japanese soldiers move past him within arm's reach. A rifleman named Moses Weaver, who'd been shot twice and had treated his own wounds with strips torn from his shirt. PFC George Ryder, who'd been hit by mortar fragments in the face and hands and couldn't see well enough to navigate the terrain alone. Private Stanley Carnes, 18 years old, on his first combat deployment, who'd been separated from his squad during the retreat and hidden through the night and the morning in a shell crater that smelled of chemical residue from a smoke canister. Sergeant William Kraft, who'd taken a bullet through his helmet. It had creased the top of his skull, leaving a 3-inch groove but not penetrating the bone, and was walking around in a daze, functionally concussed, unable to remember his unit or his name. That last one was unusual. A man who'd been shot through the helmet and was still walking was anatomically improbable, but Doss had seen stranger things. He got Kraft oriented, sat him down, performed a basic neurological assessment. Pupils responsive, though sluggish, grip strength present in both hands, verbal response coherent if confused, and determined he was stable enough to move. Kraft went down the rope at 1645 hours, the 16th man retrieved that day. By 1700 hours, Desmond Doss had been on Hacksaw Ridge for 9.5 hours. He'd retrieved 16 men. He was physically depleted in a way that was past normal exhaustion, the kind of bone-deep fatigue where you're operating on something beyond muscle power, something that doesn't have a physiological name, but that combat veterans recognize. He found one more man at 1730 hours, partially obscured by a collapsed sandbag wall, and was bringing him to the cliff's edge when Japanese mortar fire resumed. 3 rounds landed in quick succession, not targeted at him specifically, it seemed, but part of a pattern of harassment fire that the Japanese used to complicate American logistics at the cliff's edge. The 3rd round landed close enough that the blast wave knocked Doss sideways and scattered the man he was towing. He retrieved the man, got him to the edge, lowered him. Then, for the first time in 10 hours, Doss sat down at the cliff's edge and leaned against the limestone wall and closed his eyes. Not to sleep. Sleep would come later, in a foxhole at the base of the cliff, for 3 hours before someone shook him awake for the next day's assault. Just to be still for 60 seconds. And the sun was getting low over the East China Sea. The artillery fire from both sides had diminished slightly. That late afternoon lull that experienced soldiers learned to use for eating, sleeping, and writing letters they weren't sure would be delivered. The escarpment above him was quiet in a way that wasn't peaceful. It was the quiet of held breath. He'd gotten 17 men off Hacksaw Ridge. He went back up the next morning, May 5th, 1945, at the day the Army had decided to take Hacksaw Ridge back. The plan was straightforward in concept and murderous in execution. The 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 307th Infantry would go up the cargo nets and cargo ropes simultaneously, securing the cliff's lip at multiple points, and drive the Japanese back from the escarpment's crest in a coordinated sweep. Artillery would prepare the position, 75mm pack howitzers from below, and 4.2-inch chemical mortars from flanking positions. But the artillery preparation had to stop before the infantry reached the top, which meant the final 50 yards of the assault would be unsupported. H hour was 0730. Desmond Doss was at the cargo net at 0715. He'd been awake since 0330, when Japanese mortar fire had disrupted the last of his sleep. He'd used the pre-dawn hours to restock his medical bag from the battalion aid station, eat a cold ration that tasted of tin and grease, and read his Bible by the light of a carefully shaded flashlight. The passage he'd been reading that morning, he mentioned this in his post-war account, though not with any theatrical flourish, was from Psalm 121. I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills, from whence cometh my help. The irony of that verse, given where he was about to go, was the kind of thing Doss didn't comment on. He read it and went to work. The assault began at 7:30 on schedule. The first platoon, a Company B, went up 4 cargo nets simultaneously, 43 men in the first wave. Doss went up with them in the middle of the line, moving at the same pace as the riflemen to either side of him. Japanese fire came at 7:45 as soon as the first men reached the crest. 2 machine gun positions, both on the eastern end of the escarpment, opened up simultaneously. 3 men in the first wave went down in the first 10 seconds. Doss was at the crest at 0748, and he went to the nearest casualty first, a rifleman named Pete Lacey, who'd caught a round in his upper thigh, applied a field dressing and tourniquet in under 90 seconds, and was moving to the next man before the Japanese machine guns adjusted their fire. The battle for the escarpment on May 5th lasted approximately 4 hours. It was not a battle with clean lines or comprehensible movements. It was a close-range fight through shell craters and broken terrain. Americans and Japanese at ranges often under 20 yards, grenades and bayonets supplementing rifle fire when ammunition ran short. The Japanese had prepared this ground for exactly this kind of fighting, with interconnected spider holes and covered firing positions that made clearing each one a separate small unit action. In that 4-hour battle, Desmond Doss moved constantly. He moved toward gunfire, not away from it. Not because he was indifferent to danger. Every account describes him ducking at incoming rounds, pressing himself flat during mortar bursts, using terrain features for cover. He was not reckless. He was purposeful. When a man went down in front of him, he went to that man. When the immediate threat to that man subsided for 10 seconds, he treated him. When that man was stable, he moved to the next. At 0823 hours, a Japanese knee mortar round, Type 89 grenade discharger, a 50mm projectile, landed in the shell crater where Doss was treating Sergeant Thomas McCall. The explosion drove a fragment of casing into Doss's left leg above the ankle. He noted it, checked the depth, subcutaneous, not into muscle mass, not arterial, wrapped it with a field bandage, he applied himself, and continued treating McCall. He didn't report the wound. This was characteristic. In later accounts, his comrades recalled that they hadn't known he'd been hit until they noticed the bandage. By 11:45 hours, the American forces had reestablished a solid perimeter on the escarpment's crest. The Japanese had been driven back from the main position and were holding on the reverse slopes and in tunnel complexes below. The battle wasn't over. It would continue, in various forms, for another 3 weeks. But Hacksaw Ridge was, for the first time since the assault began on April 29th, firmly in American hands. In those 4 hours, Desmond Doss had treated and evacuated 3 more men from the escarpment's most heavily contested zones. Combined with the 17 from May 4th, his total over the 2 days stood at 20. The number that appears most often in accounts of Doss's action on Hacksaw Ridge is 75, the figure in his Medal of Honor citation. That number covers the totality of his service on the ridge over multiple days of fighting, extending beyond May 4th and 5th. And the 20 who came off the escarpment in those specific 48 hours represent one particularly concentrated episode within a longer story. 20 men who went up a cliff on May 4th and 5th and came back down alive, because Desmond Doss climbed back up after each of them. There's a moment in the fighting on May 5th that Doss's post-war accounts consistently return to, and that his comrades confirmed in their own depositions for his Medal of Honor citation. At approximately 10:30 hours, during a period of intense close-range fighting near the eastern end of the American perimeter, a Japanese soldier emerged from a spider hole approximately 15 yards to Doss's right. Doss was at that moment bent over a casualty, his back to the spider hole. The Japanese soldier raised his rifle. Private First Class Ralph Baker, who was covering that flank, shot the Japanese soldier. It happened in under a second. Baker saw the movement, identified the threat, and fired before the threat could complete. The Japanese soldier fell back into the spider hole. Baker would later say, in his deposition, "I shot him before he could shoot the doc. It wasn't a complicated decision." Doss, when he was told about this afterward, thanked Baker and asked him if he was all right. Baker had not been shot. The question was about the psychological weight of the act, which Doss understood instinctively. Baker said he was fine. At this moment encapsulates something that is hard to describe about what Desmond Doss created, without intending to create it, among the men of Company B. He had arrived at Fort Jackson as a problem. A man who wouldn't carry a gun, who took Saturdays off for religious reasons, who was going to get people killed. He was leaving Hacksaw Ridge as something else entirely, a man whom other men ran toward fire to protect, because he was always running toward fire to help them. Yet the relationship had inverted. The liability had become the person everyone was trying to keep alive. It's worth pausing here to consider what this means tactically. In a combat unit, every member performs a specific function. The rifleman fires, the BR gunner suppresses, the machine gun team provides fixed fire, the medic treats. In a functional unit, every member of every element also pays attention to the people around him, because combat is not individual, it's collective. As soldiers cover each other's movements, they call out threats, they drag each other out of fire. Doss had created a situation where the tactical calculation included an extra variable. Keep the medic alive, because without the medic, the wounded die. This was not unique to him. Every combat medic is covered to some degree by the soldiers around him. But Doss had been doing things on Hacksaw Ridge that went beyond a medic's function, and the men had noticed. And they noticed because they were the men he'd gone back up the cliff to retrieve. Baker had seen Doss go up that cliff on May 4th, had watched through binoculars from below, had helped receive the men being lowered on the rope. What Baker did at 10:30 hours on May 5th was not a generic tactical act. It was personal. The afternoon of May 5th brought a relative quiet to the escarpment. The Japanese resistance had not ended. It would pulse and resurge through May and into June. But the main defensive position on the crest had been broken, and the Americans were consolidating their hold. Medevac operations were moving smoothly for the first time in days, with litter teams able to use the cliff's cargo nets in something approaching a systematic way. Desmond Doss came down the cargo net at 14:30 hours. Yet he'd been on or near Hacksaw Ridge in various capacities for more than 30 hours across 2 days. His medical kit was empty except for 2 morphine syrettes that he'd been saving. His uniform was stiff with other men's dried blood. His right hand had a field dressing on it from the grenade concussion the day before, and his left leg had another from the knee mortar fragment of the morning. At the base of the cliff, he was met by Captain Vernon, who stood for a moment looking at him without saying anything. Then Vernon said, "How many?" Doss gave him the count. Vernon wrote it down. The regimental surgeon examined Doss's wounds that afternoon. The hand wound was superficial, a few fragments of grenade casing under the skin, easily removed. The leg wound was more concerning. The fragment had not penetrated muscle, but had traveled along the subcutaneous tissue and was sitting against the tibia. The surgeon extracted it with forceps, which Doss described afterward as somewhat uncomfortable. He was given sulfa tablets, a fresh dressing, and told to rest. He was back on duty the next morning. In the days that followed, May 6th through May 21st, when the Maeda escarpment fighting finally concluded, Doss continued to operate as the first platoon medic. He was not again in a situation of isolated, prolonged rescue like those of May 4th and 5th. But the fighting was continuous and casualties were regular. He treated dozens more men in those weeks, always moving toward the casualty, always under fire to some degree. On May 21st, while crawling to reach a wounded man near the escarpment's reverse slope, Doss was hit by a sniper's round that fractured his arm. He applied a splint himself, his arm, his hands, the practice motions that had become as automatic as the prayer, and waited for litter bearers. When the litter bearers arrived, and he gave up his place on the litter for a man he considered more seriously wounded and walked to the aid station. En route to the aid station, the litter he'd given up his place on was hit by a mortar round. The wounded man it was carrying was killed. Doss's reaction to this was not something he discussed. He was evacuated from Okinawa on May 23rd. He would not return to combat. What does it take to go back up that cliff? Not physically. The physical requirements are calculable. Weight of the climb, time required, caloric expenditure, the mechanical demands of the rope work and the pulling and the crawling. All of that is measurable. What does it take psychologically? There's a concept in military psychology called combat stress reaction, which is the clinical term for what used to be called shell shock, battle fatigue, combat exhaustion. It's not a single thing. It's a spectrum of responses to sustained extreme stress, including hypervigilance, intrusive memories, dissociation, physical tremors, and what researchers have called moral injury, the damage done when a person's actions or witnessed events violate their core moral framework. Desmond Doss had a specific and unusual relationship with the concept of moral injury. For most combat soldiers, the risk of moral injury comes from being required to kill, from the necessary violence of warfare conflicting with civilized norms. For Doss, that particular risk didn't exist. He would not kill. He treated the enemy wounded with the same care as his own. He had excised the primary source of moral injury from his combat experience before it could occur. What he had instead, what came through in his post-war accounts, in the mild, understated way he described the things he'd seen and done, was the weight of triage. The decisions about who couldn't be saved. The bodies he'd had to crawl past on Hacksaw Ridge because stopping would have cost a living man his chance. At the faces of men he had treated and lost anyway, despite the morphine and the bandages and the pressure and the words, "You're okay. You're going to be okay." He carried those, not loudly, not with drama. He carried them the way a man carries a stone in his pack. You adjust your stride, you find your balance, you keep moving. The faith that made him refuse a rifle was the same faith that sent him back up the cliff. Not because he was unafraid. He was afraid, viscerally and continuously, in the way that any sensible person in his position would be afraid. But fear, in his framework, was not a reason to stop. It was information. It told him there was danger. It didn't tell him what to do about it. He'd made that decision before he ever left Lynchburg. The decision was, I will serve. I will not kill. I will go wherever they send me, and I will bring back whoever I can bring back. That decision, made once, did not need to be remade every time he went up the cliff, but it was already made. All he had to do was implement it. While Desmond Doss was being evacuated from Okinawa in May of 1945, the island's fighting continued without him. The Shuri line finally collapsed in late May, when flanking movements and relentless pressure forced the Japanese to abandon Shuri Castle on May 29th. General Ushijima withdrew his remaining forces to the island's southern tip, where they fought until June 22nd. On that date, Ushijima and his chief of staff performed ritual suicide in a cave above the sea, and organized resistance on Okinawa effectively ended. The final casualty count for the Okinawa campaign was staggering. American military dead, 12,520. Wounded, 38,000 more. Japanese military dead, approximately 110,000, with the precise count uncertain because so many were in sealed cave complexes or buried under artillery. Okinawan civilian dead, estimates range from 40,000 to 150,000. And accounting for as much as one-third of the island's pre-war population. The battle had consumed 82 days and produced proportional casualties that, to American planners projecting the invasion of the Japanese home islands were deeply alarming. The projected casualties for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Kyushu, scheduled for November 1945, were modeled substantially on Okinawa. Some estimates ran as high as 1 million American casualties for the full invasion of Japan. These projections shaped, in part, the decision to use atomic weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. Doss was on a hospital ship in the Pacific when the bombs were dropped. He heard about them on the ship's radio. His recorded reaction to the news was brief. He was glad the war was ending, and sorry about the Japanese who had died. The Japanese surrender was announced on August 15, 1945. Desmond Doss was still recovering from his arm fracture and the various other wounds he'd accumulated on Okinawa. He had also contracted tuberculosis, a not uncommon consequence of sustained service in the Pacific's disease environment, which would require an extended hospitalization and leave him with compromised lung function for the rest of his life. He was in a hospital in Virginia when he received word that he'd been recommended for the Medal of Honor. The Medal of Honor ceremony took place on October 12, 1945, in the Rose Garden at the White House. President Harry S. Truman placed the medal around Doss's neck and reportedly said to him, "I'm proud of you. You really deserve this. I consider this a greater honor than being president." This quote appears in most biographical accounts. Its accuracy, as with many memorable quotes attributed to famous people in emotionally charged moments, is uncertain. What is certain is that Truman gave the medal and said something complimentary. Doss's Medal of Honor citation credited him with saving the lives of 75 men during the fighting on Hacksaw Ridge. The citation noted specifically his refusal to leave the escarpment until all retrievable wounded had been evacuated, his treatment of casualties under direct fire, and his action in throwing back an enemy grenade that would otherwise have caused casualties. He was, at that time, the first conscientious objector in American history to receive the Medal of Honor. He received it wearing a uniform with no combat infantryman's badge because he was a medic, and no marksman's badge because he'd never qualified with a rifle. The left side of his chest held the Purple Heart with oak leaf cluster indicating multiple wounds, the Bronze Star with V device for valor, and the Combat Medic Badge. The Medal of Honor went around his neck on a light blue ribbon. He accepted it with the same manner he'd maintained through the entire proceeding, quietly, without visible agitation, saying thank you in a way that suggested he meant it literally rather than ceremonially. His wife Dorothy was there. She'd been waiting for him since April 1942. 3.5 years of letters written by lantern light, of reading casualty lists with a held breath, of being a military wife in a small Virginia city during a global war. When she saw the medal around his neck, she apparently said nothing. She took his hand. Desmond Doss returned to Lynchburg, Virginia, in late 1945. He was 27 years old, married, tubercular, with compromised vision in one eye from a fragment wound he'd received on Okinawa, and limited mobility in the arm that had been fractured by the sniper's bullet on May 21st. He did not, in the post-war years, pursue a public life. He and Dorothy moved to Rising Fawn, Georgia, at a small community in the northwest corner of the state near the Tennessee border, where he worked as a farmer and a carpenter when his health permitted. He spent approximately 5 years in and out of VA hospitals dealing with the tuberculosis, which required surgery to remove portions of both lungs. He lost 50% of his pulmonary function, eventually requiring a hearing aid, a complication of the streptomycin treatments used to combat the tuberculosis, which carried ototoxicity as a side effect. He did not talk about Hacksaw Ridge much, not because he was traumatized by it. The accounts of people who knew him suggest he was not, at least not in the ways that commonly manifest, but because it didn't seem to him to require narration. He'd done what he'd done. It was done. The men he'd brought off the ridge were alive or they weren't. The ones who were alive were out there living their lives, and that seemed to him a sufficient conclusion. He accepted speaking invitations from veterans organizations and Seventh-day Adventist communities occasionally, and he told the story in those contexts in the same way he described his wounds to the regimental surgeon on May 5th. Accurately, without embellishment, with a clinical detachment that was not coldness but simply the way he processed things. He said, "I was concerned," where another man might have said, "I was terrified." He said, "I thought it was important to go back," where another man might have said, "I had no choice." Dorothy died of cancer in 1991. He remarried Francis Dumont, whom he'd known from his church community, in 1993. Francis later described him as a genuinely gentle man, not in the sense of being weak or passive, but in the sense of being free from the impulse to dominate or to perform. He was quiet. He liked animals. He worked in his garden when his health permitted. He was asked, in an interview late in his life, whether he ever regretted not carrying a weapon. He said he'd never thought of it as something he regretted because he'd never seriously considered the alternative. It would have been like regretting being right-handed. It was just how he was. He died on March 23, 2006, at his home in Piedmont, Alabama. He was 87 years old. He was buried at Spring Hill Memorial Park in Chattanooga, Tennessee. His grave is marked simply, his name, his rank, his dates, and the Medal of Honor. Hacksaw Ridge and what happened there has outlasted Desmond Doss by nearly 2 decades and shows no sign of diminishing in cultural relevance. The 2016 film, directed by Mel Gibson, Hacksaw Ridge, starring Andrew Garfield as Doss, grossed $180 million worldwide against a production budget of $40 million. It was nominated for 6 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, and then won 2, Best Film Editing and Best Sound Mixing. It introduced Desmond Doss to a global audience that had largely not heard of him. The film's historical accuracy is, as is always the case with dramatic biopics, a mixed record. The combat sequences are realistic in their chaos and brutality, drawing on the actual accounts of veterans who served on Hacksaw Ridge. The basic facts of Doss's rescue operations are faithfully represented, though compressed and occasionally dramatized. Certain personal details, particularly around the family background and the pre-war period, are simplified. One thing the film captures that no amount of dramatization can misrepresent: the physical reality of Hacksaw Ridge as a fighting position. The limestone escarpment, the cargo nets, the exposure on the crest. These elements are presented with an accuracy that reflects serious research and consultation with veterans' accounts. You watch the film and you understand, viscerally, what it meant to climb that cliff. Then you think about a man doing it 17 times in one day, and the arithmetic of that becomes something beyond impressive. The surviving veterans of the 307th Infantry who lived to see the film had varying reactions. Some found it too violent. Some felt it underrepresented the contributions of other men in the unit. Some were moved by it in ways that surprised them, watching events they'd witnessed or participated in rendered on a movie screen 50 years later. Several noted that Garfield's physical portrayal of Doss, the quiet certainty of his manner, the way he moved toward danger rather than away from it, was accurate in ways that surprised them. What does Desmond Doss's story mean for the military's understanding of its own people? This is not a rhetorical question. It has a practical answer, visible in the Army's evolving policies regarding conscientious, objectors, and non-combatant service members. When Doss was inducted in 1942, the Army had no coherent framework for integrating men who refused weapons on religious grounds but still wished to serve in combat roles. The existing 1AO classification existed but was poorly administered, and the informal response to such men, harassment, attempted discharge, marginalization, reflected an institutional assumption that a combat unit required every member to be capable of and willing to engage the enemy with weapons. Hacksaw Ridge demonstrated, through a single extreme case, that this assumption was incomplete. The unit function was not degraded by having a member who wouldn't carry a rifle. In the specific case of a combat medic, The unit function was arguably enhanced by having a member whose absolute commitment to preservation of life, all life, yet including enemy life, made him more effective at the thing the unit needed a medic to do. This argument was not universally accepted in the post-war military establishment, and the Army's handling of conscientious objectors remained inconsistent for decades. But Doss's example established a data point that could not be ignored. Here was a man who went into combat without a weapon, repeatedly, over months and years, and then performed his function in ways that saved more lives than many armed men in comparable positions. The broader implication for military doctrine, for the theory of what makes a unit effective, is that commitment and capability are not the same thing as weapon carrying. A man who will run into fire, who will go back up the cliff, who will stay until everyone retrievable has been retrieved, is performing a function as militarily significant as the man who shoots accurately. Now, the metrics of that function are different. The courage required for it is not. Contemporary military medicine, particularly in the realm of TCC, or tactical combat casualty care, has continued to evolve in ways that reflect what Doss practiced intuitively. The emphasis on immediate treatment under fire, on moving casualties rapidly rather than waiting for rear area facilities, and on the medic as an active battlefield presence rather than a shelter-based resource. All of these principles are consistent with the approach Doss took on Hacksaw Ridge, decades before they were systematized. The trauma surgery capabilities that now travel with forward military medical teams, capabilities that can keep a man alive in circumstances that would have been fatal in 1945, represent a direct evolution from the lessons learned by combat medics in places like Hacksaw Ridge. Yet the doctrine changed because men like Doss demonstrated what was possible when a medic went forward. On the limestone face of the Maeda Escarpment, there is nothing now that marks what happened there in April and May of 1945. The island of Okinawa is today the site of significant American military presence. Kadena Air Base, Camp Foster, and other installations. The escarpment is now overgrown, the shell craters filled in by decades of plant growth and rain. The cargo nets are long gone, yet the limestone is still there, the same limestone that Doss's rope scraped against as he hauled wounded men to the edge. Visitors to the area find a quiet hillside. Nothing about its surface suggests what it cost. The men who came down that cliff on Doss's rope were real people with the rest of their lives ahead of them in May 1945. They went home to farms in Georgia and apartments in Brooklyn and family businesses in California and ranches in Montana. Yet they married and had children and worked for decades and grew old and died in their beds. Most of them, eventually. Some of them stayed in touch with Doss. Some sent Christmas cards until they couldn't anymore. Some never spoke of Okinawa at all, and carried the escarpment inside them for the rest of their lives the way veterans carry those things. Silently, at an interior distance that the people around them could feel but not quite reach. Harold Lauer, the first man Doss pulled off the escarpment on May 4th, the one with the tourniquet on his arm. James Doris with the splinted leg. Roy Grimes, who had been playing dead for 7 hours. Moses Weaver, who had treated his own wounds with strips of shirt. George Ryder, who couldn't see. Stanley Carnes, who was 18 years old. William Kraft with the groove in his skull, and others. 17 on May 4th. 3 more on May 5th. 20. And they came down the cliff alive because one man climbed back up, again and again, with a rope and a medical kit, and a faith that was as practical as it was spiritual. He didn't go back up the cliff because he was fearless. He went back because, to him, there was no other option available. The men at the base of the cliff watched him go up each time. They stopped being surprised by it eventually. And that's the thing about witnessing genuine conviction. You stop being surprised by it and start taking it as a fact of the world, the way you take gravity as a fact. Doss goes back up. That's what Doss does. They received the men he sent down. They were ready with stretchers and aid stations and litter teams. They did their part, which was not small. But the person who made it possible who closed the distance between the wounded men trapped on the escarpment and the men ready to receive them below, was the one man in the entire operation who wasn't carrying a gun. 3 days after the Okinawa campaign ended, an Army photographer found Desmond Doss sitting outside a hospital tent at a rear area medical facility, reading a small New Testament that was visibly worn along the spine. The photographer asked if he could take a picture. Doss said yes. The resulting photograph shows a young man in a hospital gown, right hand bandaged, left leg elevated. He is looking at the camera without expression, not hostile, not performing, just looking. Behind him, the tent canvas is bright white in the Pacific sun. He looks, in the photograph, exactly like what he is. A young man from Lynchburg, Virginia, who spent the worst years of his century doing the thing he was put on earth to do, and who is now, and in the relative quiet of a place without artillery fire, resting for a little while before whatever comes next. The New Testament in his hands is the same one Dorothy gave him before he shipped out. He'd carried it through Guam, through Leyte, through Okinawa, through the cargo nets and the shell craters, and the 30-plus hours on Hacksaw Ridge. The binding is repaired with surgical tape in 2 places. That photograph is one of the few images taken of Doss during the war that shows him not in motion. In all the others, the Medal of Honor ceremony, the unit photographs from training, he's either moving or preparing to move. The hospital photograph is the exception. He is, for a brief moment, still. He went home on a hospital ship 6 weeks later. Immediate aftermath. In the 48 hours following the final consolidation of Hacksaw Ridge, on May 5, 1945, and the 307th Infantry Regiment filed casualty reports and began the paperwork that would eventually produce official records of the engagement. Captain Vernon submitted his initial after-action report, which noted, among other elements, the actions of PFC Desmond T. Doss over the preceding 2 days. The battalion surgeon, examining the men who'd been evacuated from the escarpment, that noted in his own report that the quality of the field treatment received by many of the casualties was unusually high for battlefield conditions. Tourniquet applications correct, wound packing appropriate, morphine administration controlled. These were not the results of chance. They were the results of a medic who knew what he was doing and had the steadiness to do it under fire. The regimental chaplain visited Doss that evening at the aid station where he was resting. What they discussed was not recorded. Protagonist's fate. Desmond Doss spent 1945 through 1953 in and out of VA hospitals, fighting the tuberculosis that had established itself in his lungs during the Pacific Campaign. Surgeons removed portions of both lungs in surgeries that reduced his respiratory capacity by half. The streptomycin treatments that saved his life eventually cost him most of his hearing, a common consequence of high-dose streptomycin therapy in that era. And he lived with these diminishments without apparent resentment. He farmed, he built things with his hands. He raised a son, Desmond Thomas Doss, Jr., born in 1946, and tried to give him the same faith and the same ethical seriousness that had been given to him on Easley Avenue in Lynchburg, in the house with the picture of Cain and Abel on the wall. He died on March 23, 2006. He was 87. His son was with him. Historical legacy. Desmond Doss's example functions, out in the military's institutional memory and in the broader cultural record, as evidence of a particular kind of human capacity. The capacity to make a decision once and keep implementing it across months and years of conditions designed to erode it. He entered basic training in 1942 with a set of convictions about what he would and would not do. Those convictions were tested immediately, relentlessly, and in ways that ranged from the petty harassment of barracks life to the existential terror of a Japanese counterattack in the dark on top of a 400-foot cliff. The convictions held. The Medal of Honor he received in 1945 recognized a specific set of actions. What it could not fully capture was the continuous nature of the commitment those actions represented, not a moment of heroism, but years of a consistent orientation toward the person bleeding in front of him, always, regardless of the conditions. The military's approach to conscientious objectors evolved substantially after World War II, particularly during the Vietnam era, when the percentage of Americans claiming conscientious objector status rose dramatically, and the legal frameworks for evaluating those claims were significantly refined. Doss is not solely responsible for that evolution, but his example, preserved in the Medal of Honor citation, in the unit history of the 307th Infantry, shut in the memories of the men who watched him from the base of that cliff, was part of what made the evolution possible. He showed that the conviction could coexist with the service, that a man could refuse to kill and still be, by any meaningful measure, a soldier. 20 men came down that cliff alive. That number is not a metaphor. It is 20 specific human beings with specific names and specific wounds and specific amounts of remaining time on Earth, who were on Hacksaw Ridge and then were not, because one man kept going back up. The arithmetic of it is simple. The thing that made it possible is not. Desmond Doss went up that cliff 17 times in one day. He went up again the following morning. He did it without a weapon, without support, on an enemy-held position, in a body that was running on 3 hours of sleep and cold rations, and a faith that the people around him had been trying to erode since the first Saturday at Fort Jackson. It held. If this story moved you the way it moved us, hit that like button and subscribe for more forgotten stories from the corners of history that deserve to be remembered. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for keeping these memories alive.